This is ridiculous how it looks. Yeah.
I've always wondered why some furniture feels high-end, even when on paper it doesn't seem all that different. So this build was really an experiment. I wanted to make a cabinet that was still useful, but carried itself a little more like a piece of art. And the tricky part is the details doing the most work are usually the ones nobody talks about. Same material, same basic function, and yet one piece feels ordinary and another feels considered. You notice it in the proportions, in the way the surfaces meet, in the little transitions your eye probably doesn't stop to name, but still registers. So I started with a few rough slabs and tried to find out where the difference actually comes from. The material I started with was still around 50 millimeters thick, which was obviously far too much for a cabinet shell like this. So the first job was getting it into a form that could be worked with. If I built the shell at that thickness, it would look heavy in all the wrong ways. And I didn't just want to plane everything down to a final thickness either, because that would mean turning most of the material into shavings for no good reason. So the obvious answer was to resaw the boards on a bandsaw. That way, I could keep the material, get the thickness closer to where I actually needed it, and still have enough left to build the cabinet properly. It's a bit more work up front, but a lot less wasteful than flattening 50 millimeters of walnut down into dust just to end up with a cabinet that should never have been that thick in the first place. From there, it was the usual rhythm. Jointing everything flat, planing it into consistency, which is more or less what milling really is. You start with wood that still has its own opinion about what it wants to be, and you keep working until it becomes willing to cooperate. I also usually mill my boards about a millimeter thicker than the final dimension. So if I need 16, I'll bring them back down to 17 first. Because after glue up, I almost always end up running the panels through the drum sander and then cleaning them up by hand afterwards. So if you want to land on your perfect final thickness, you kinda have to think about that earlier. Otherwise, you hit your number too soon and then spend the rest of the build watching it disappear. Once everything was planed to the same thickness, I glued the boards back together to build up the final depth of the cabinet. Which sounds a little backwards when you say it out loud. Cut it apart, flatten it, then glue it right back together again. But this part gives you the control over the final surface, and control is usually what makes something feel expensive long before the finish ever touches it. At this point, the wood finally started to feel less like rough material and more like actual panels, which is usually the point where the build starts becoming a little less forgiving. For all you beginners out there, some very important information. Always when you make your panels like this, make them oversized. Why? Because right now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna cut a sliver from this side, still a bit oversized,
Then I'm gonna turn the piece around and cut here another sliver. This way, on my table saw, I know that these two sides are parallel. If these two sides are parallel, then I can easily use a jig, or in my case, the sliding table, to cut the miter, which is 100% perpendicular to both sides. This way, your cabinet won't be wonky and you won't have gaps within the miter joint.
So this part was really about removing as many excuses as possible before the miters went in. Get the panels straight, get them parallel, and only then start counting the angles that actually matter.
Now that we have this side cut, we should flip this around. I still have about 1 centimeter. And now I'm gonna run it on the other side, just to make sure, because as you can see, for example, here, we have cut issues and it's not perfectly flat and parallel. Another very important thing which I was doing, as you saw my cuts, you always want to be beside the cut. You don't want to be here when you're pushing the panel through.
Miters are one of those details that don't ask for much attention when they go right, but immediately pull the whole piece down when they don't. A cabinet like this can survive a lot of quiet imperfections, but corners are usually not one of them. While the parts were still flat and easy to reference, I cut the grooves that would be much more annoying to do later. This is one of those small do it now or regret it later decisions that almost nobody notices in the finished piece, which is probably why it matters. Once that was done, I could start laying out the inside. Not just where the divisors would go, but how the cabinet would feel when opened, because the outside of a piece might catch your attention first. But the inside is usually where it proves whether it deserved it or not. The stop grooves for the dividers were actually pretty simple. I just clamped the piece of scrap in place and used it as a guide for the router. It's not a glamorous setup, and it definitely doesn't look like the kind of thing people imagine when they hear fine furniture. The process usually feels a lot more improvised than that. Before I could close up the shell, I wanted to line the back panel in velvet. Partially for the look, obviously, but also because I liked what it would do to the sound of the cabinet once the glass started to land against it.
Okay, last thing we need to do is to align this with felt. And I have 3 colors here, and I don't know which one to use. This one I've already used on my box project. I'll leave a link down below. It's a great green color, but I don't think I'm gonna be using this. And from these two, I like both, but I think the contrast with the walnut goes better with the purple. So what I think I'm gonna do is I'm gonna use the purple one as a background. Let me know down below if you think it was a good color to use.
I tried purple first. I wanted to like it. I really did. But it was too thin. It didn't sit the way I wanted, and once it was in place, it felt more decorative than useful.
So I didn't like how the purple material was feeling. It was too thin, and I don't know, something was off about it, and I decided to go with the red one.
The red was immediately better. Warmer, heavier, and quieter somehow. And once I knew the doors were going to have bubinga accents, it made even more sense. The red and the bubinga were much closer to each other, so the whole cabinet started feeling like it belonged to one palette instead of competing with itself. Once the velvet was in, the shell was finally ready to stop being a group of prepared parts and start becoming an actual cabinet. And that always feels like a small shift in a build. Up to that point, almost everything was still negotiable. Boards can be recut, layouts can move, decisions can still pretend they weren't final. Glue up is usually where that stops. It's the moment where the project becomes a real object and starts telling the truth about whether the idea was any good to begin with. Once the carcass came out of the clamps, that approach started paying for itself almost immediately. Because now I wasn't cutting parts for a theoretical cabinet anymore. I was cutting parts for this cabinet. This exact one with whatever tiny differences had shown up along the way. So the next step was building the internal grid out of walnut milled down to 16 millimeters. Not especially dramatic work, but the kind where accuracy starts multiplying. Once parts begin repeating, every small inconsistency gets easier to see. The goal here wasn't to make the inside complicated, it was to make it feel resolved. Something balanced enough to look intentional, but not so rigid that it started feeling generic. And this is the nice thing about an interior like this. Once the proportions are right, it doesn't need much. The pieces go in, the spacing starts to make sense, and the cabinet gets quieter somehow. That's what I really wanted from it. Not a technical trick, not some dramatic joinery flex, just an inside that felt like it belonged to the same piece as the outside. The inside was finally doing its share of the work. The cabinet no longer felt like a shell waiting for content, which also made the next problem more obvious.
Oh yeah.
Once the inside was done, the next problem was the front. At that point, there was just a lot of walnut. And if I left it like that, the whole cabinet was going to feel a little too flat. So the doors needed something to break that up. Not enough to completely change the cabinet, just enough contrast to give the front a bit more life. That's where the bubinga and brass came in. The bubinga gave me the second tone, and the brass added a thinner line that could catch light and separate the surfaces a little. And once I knew that was the direction, the doors started making a lot more sense. By then, the contrast was starting to show up properly. The walnut still carried most of the visual weight, but the bubinga gave the front a little resistance, just enough to keep it from becoming one large, uninterrupted surface. The brass did something similar, but in a quieter way. It wasn't there to dominate the doors or show itself across the room. It was there to break the surface at exactly the point where the wood might otherwise become too heavy. I cut the grooves a little shallow on purpose, so the brass would sit proud of the surface and could be sanded flush later, which sounds simple enough. Right up until you remember the brass is being held with CA glue, and heat is not especially good to it. So this part becomes a strange mix of precision and restraint. You want everything seated cleanly, but you also know that if you get too aggressive later, the whole thing can start coming back out for reasons that feel very avoidable in hindsight. Sanding it flush was probably the most delicate part of the whole door sequence. Not difficult in a dramatic sense, just one of those jobs where going faster only makes things worse. The trick is heat. Too much of it, and the glue lets go before the surface is where you want it. So the process ends up being a little slow and a little more careful than something that looks this solid probably ought to require. But once it works, the effect is exactly what I was after. The brass doesn't really look like a decoration at first. It reads as a shift in the surface, something your eye notices before it fully understands why. After that, it was trying to drill the hinge caps in the doors, which should have been a fairly routine job, except bubinga had other ideas. Walnut is usually pretty cooperative. Bubinga is not. And the second the beat hit that part of the door, the whole operation got a lot less graceful. You could smell it burning almost immediately. The beat was working hard. The wood was working even harder, and I was somewhere in the middle trying to pretend this is still counted as a clean process. It did eventually go through, but not with anything I would describe as elegance, which felt appropriate, honestly. Up to this point, the cabinet had been getting more refined visually, and then, right at the end, one of the nicest looking materials in the whole piece reminded me it was also one of the least interested in cooperating. Once the holes were done, the doors were basically ready. I didn't mount the hinges yet. It wasn't worth drilling into the cabinet before the finish. But I could at least place the doors on the front and get a sense of where the piece was going. This was one of those moments where the material was much prettier than I expected. But even then, something was still missing. The cabinet was there. The materials were there. The proportions were there. But it still didn't quite have a stance. And that turned out to matter more than I expected. Up to this point, most of the cabinet's identity had come from surfaces, proportions, and the way the materials were working together. But none of that really matters if the piece doesn't know how to stand. Because the base wasn't just supporting the cabinet, it was deciding how the whole thing carried itself. So before any of the actual legs were cut, I made a template out of melamine. That was really the only way to get 4 matching parts without turning the whole process into a slow drift away from the original idea. And with curves like this, small differences don't stay small for very long. One leg being slightly off doesn't just affect one leg. It changes the way the whole base feels once everything starts meeting in the middle. I cut the walnut oversize on the bed saw first, just leaving enough material that I could come back and let the template do the more precise work afterwards. That's usually the calmer way to do it. Remove most of the waste quickly, then try to become a much more careful person once the router gets involved. The only problem was that the legs were 40 millimeters thick and my trim bit was only 36, which is just enough of a difference to become annoying. So I couldn't just run the whole profile in one clean pass and be done with it. Oh no, I had to start from the bottom, make the first cut, lift the router, follow the new shoulder, take another 0.5 millimeter, then do it again. It turned into this slow little routine with the plunge router. Cut, lift, reset, and cut again. Gradually working my way down until the bottom of the leg was finally riding cleanly on the template, which was not exactly the elegant version of a template routing, but it worked. I could have bought a longer bit and made the whole problem disappear. And to be fair, that probably would have been the cleaner solution. But at that point, I wasn't going to stop the project and wait for one more tool just to save myself a bit of patience. Sometimes it makes more sense just to work with what you've got, even if it takes longer, even if the process looks a little more stubborn than elegant. And once it was done, the result was the same. The shape was clean, the template had done its job, and the legs finally started looking like they belonged to the same place. The flat faces were easy enough after that. Those went over the jointer and cleaned up pretty quickly. The curved sides were a little different. There's not really a machine that gives you all the elegance you imagine in your head, so most of the work ended up happening with a handheld belt sander, which is a very efficient way to introduce both refinement and a mild panic into the same afternoon. But this is also where the legs started becoming what I wanted them to be. Not just support, but a shape, something with little movement in it. I didn't want the base to feel heavy, in the obvious way. The cabinet already had enough mass up on top. What it needed down here was something that could carry that weight without looking clumsy under it. After that, I rounded the edges with a router and then sanded everything again to soften it further, which is one of those quiet details that does a surprising amount of work. Sharp edges tend to make curves feel more mechanical than they should. Softening them just a little helps the whole base feel less manufactured and a little more finished. Then came the holes, which sounds straightforward enough until you remember that once multiple curved parts have to line up with each other, straightforward becomes a fairly optimistic word. I drilled the first pair on the drill press, putting the holes in both legs before glue up, thinking that was the cleaner way to do it. It was cleaner as a theory, not as much as a result. Once the pieces were together, the holes didn't line up the way I wanted. Not disastrously, just enough to remind me that wood has a very casual relationship with your confidence. So, on the second pair, I changed the approach. I drilled the first leg, used that as a guide, and only drilled the rest after the glue up was already done. If you like this kind of slower, detail heavy build, maybe subscribe. And if you got a strong opinion on this base, whether you'd have gone with something cleaner or something even weirder, let me know down in the comments. Once the parts started lining up properly, the base finally began to make sense as its own object. Up until then, I'd been working on curves, surfaces, and alignment. But now the whole thing had a stance. It had posture. And I think that's what I was really after from the beginning. Not a base that tried to disappear, but one that gave the cabinet a different kind of presence than a normal box on straight legs ever could. And then came the part where the cabinet and the base had to come together. This was the moment I'd been building towards the whole time, because until then I still didn't fully know whether the lower part of the piece was going to support the cabinet or quietly fail. To glue the cabinet onto the base, I needed even downward pressure. Which sounds simple enough, right up until you realize you don't have a very elegant way to do it. So I used ratchet straps, which is not especially refined, but neither explaining to yourself why you need to build the same cabinet twice.
This is ridiculous how it looks. Yeah. It's the only way I could think of to have pressure from the top and keep it square, because I did make it square. So it looks ridiculous, but it really works, and that's what matters. Ever want to do this? Don't bother with this. Just throw some threaded inserts in the legs and then some bolts from the top, and it will hold perfectly. In my case, I just didn't want to use screws, and I want to see how ridiculous I can make this. And it seems that I did manage to make it look ridiculous.
By now, the hard part was over. The cabinet finally had its stance. It finally felt like an object. All that was left was to wake the wood up and see if the finished surface could carry the rest of the way.
If you wouldn't be using Rubio, it wouldn't be a YouTube video, right? Let's put this up.
By this point, the cabinet was finally where I wanted it structurally. The shell felt good. The front had enough tension. The base was doing what I needed to do. But unfinished wood has a way of keeping a piece slightly at arm's length. You can see the form, but you still haven't really met it yet. And that's usually the moment I look forward to the most. Not because finishing is especially exciting as a process, but because it's the first time the wood stops speaking in draft form. With something like Rubio, the change is immediate. The grain wakes up the color, settles into itself, and suddenly all quieter choices you've been making for days start becoming easier to read. Up to this point, I'd been looking at it in pieces: a shell, a front, a base, a collection of decisions. But once the doors were mounted and moving the way they were supposed to, the piece finally started looking like a piece I was imagining. That was also the moment where the smaller details from the beginning started coming back together. The way the front sat against the cabinet, the weight of the movement, the quieter feeling of the inside once the doors were opened. Even the sound was different. And I think that's really what I was chasing with this whole build. Not extravagance, not complexity for its own sake. Just a piece where the details kept reinforcing each other until the whole thing started feeling a little more deliberate than it needed to be. I still don't know if that line between furniture and art is something you ever fully defined. It's probably not. But I do think some pieces get closer than others. The ones that usually do get there through a collection of small decisions that most people would never point to individually. A quieter interior, better movement, a little more contrast on the front, a base with some posture instead of just four legs doing their job. None of those things are especially dramatic on their own, but together they change the way the whole piece feels. And I think that's probably the answer I was looking for from the beginning. Furniture starts feeling high-end when fewer parts feel accidental. If you want to build your own version, I've put the plans and the model on my website. For now, they're free, at least for a little while. At some point, I'll probably charge a few dollars for them, 3, maybe 5, but for now, you can just have them. And if you've made it this far, thanks for watching. I really wanted this one to feel different.